like that's different stuff, but I mean, they have to cook so much different. It's just tiresome. It was good, but it wasn't excellent. Oh, it was so much fun. Yeah, we just went to the beach and to the pool. Beach pool and eat. That's about all. I still wouldn't go. Everything's so expensive. Yeah.
He did. Right.
Where'd y'all go? Did you? Oh yeah, that's right. I saw the bear. I saw where Paul was feeding the bears.
He was trying. He almost got ate by a bear.
I know. I saw that. Good morning.
Let's try that again. Good morning. It's good to see you all this morning. I may need some help, Richard, getting through this class this morning. Friday afternoon, I was doing some research and studying and preparing I actually had notes already prepared for this lesson, and I went back and looked at it, and I wasn't happy with all of it, so I sat down. I was doing some more reading and research and making some more notes, and about 3 o'clock or so, saw the storm started to come in, and so I thought, well, I better charge. I was working at home, so I thought, well, I better make sure my battery in my laptop has a full charge, so I went and plugged it in and walked out and sat down on the patio for a few minutes, and here it come, right? And it was just pouring, and it started hailing. It was so bad, I couldn't stay under the carport. I had to go back in the house, so I went back in and unplugged the laptop, had a full charge on it, and I sat down in my recliner and started working on my notes and finishing things up, and it was somewhere around 4:30, about 4 o'clock. Lights flickered a couple times, and then the power went out. And there I was sitting in my electric recliner. I was eventually able to get out of it. Actually, I have a battery backup in it, but you've seen, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, so if you have one of these, I'm not making fun of you. I kind of am, I guess. But these chairs that lift you up, so you can stand up, which I'll probably need someday soon. It takes longer than it takes to get out of one of those, to get out of my recliner with the battery backup on it. So anyway, I finished it all up, and I got the PowerPoint updated, and I uploaded. I was able to use my hotspot 10 with my phone. I was able to upload it to the internet, so we have the PowerPoint. And then we got here to the church building this morning, and I looked at Colleen and I went, I never printed off those notes. All those edited notes that I had, because the power was out, I couldn't print it off at home, so we'll try to get through this morning together. Luke 2, verses 40 through 40, or verses 41 through 52, we have this account of Jesus at the age of 12 in the temple. And most of us are familiar with this. This is a story that probably we heard a lot growing up as children. We learned about Jesus in the temple at 12 years old, his parents leaving him behind. They go on their journey and they realize he's not there, and they go back to find him, and they find him there in the temple. Have you ever lost one of your kids? It happened to us years ago. I remember, Colleen, I think we were in J.C. Penney. I don't remember where we were at.
Which time?
Well, okay. I always thought that those parents that walk around with leashes on their kids, have you seen this? I always thought, that's so cruel. Yeah, but you understand now, don't you? We probably needed one of those for David at times, right? And we were in JCPenney one time, and he was little, I don't know, 2, 3 years old, and his mother had given him strict instructions to stay with us. And so we were looking for something. The next thing we know, David's not there. And we can't find him. And we're panicking, and I'm getting ready to call somebody in store security to shut the store down because we don't know where he's at. And we start searching, and at one point, I'm walking down the aisle looking for him, and on the far end, I see him run from one set of racks across the aisle to the other with a look of panic on his face because he was looking for us too. I'll never forget that moment. I can't imagine how Jesus' parents felt, even at the age of 12. So this is a very interesting text. And I think there's a lot here for us, but I also think there's some good application here for us too that we need to think about. As Jesus is separated from, well, let's lay it out like this to start. As Jesus is separated from his parents, do we ever find ourselves separated from him? What does sin do? Isaiah said sin separates us from God, right? But has God gone anywhere? Has Jesus gone anywhere? No. So if we're separated from him, whose fault is it? It's ours. And so what do we have to do? We need to find him again. We need to search him out, and we need to find him. Isaiah chapter 55 verse 6 says, "Seek the Lord while he may be found, and call upon him while he is near." Don't let him get too far away. And so, what kind of searching did they do? We'll talk about this, and what kind of searching we need to do. And when we find him, what happens? Where do we find him? Where will we find him now? I think there's some great parallels in this story. So let's begin this morning by looking at the discovering. Verses 41 through 44, let's read that together. "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he had become 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning, after spending the full number of days, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of it. But supposed that he be in the caravan, and went a day's journey, and they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances." So, the story is laid out for us. As was their custom, there were 3 feasts that they were required to attend every year, but really by this time, the Feast of the Passover was really the only one that, the other ones were kind of, they'd let them slide or whatever. The Feast of the Passover, they had to be there. But what we find here is that Joseph and Mary, as they're raising their young son Jesus, when the children of God came together to assemble, where were they? They were there with the people of God. And I think, as we talked about first hour this morning, there's a great lesson in there for us. Where do our children need to be? Where do we as parents need to be with our children? But in the house of God, right? This was their habit. This was their custom. This is what they did. And I doubt that they had to, when the time drew near, I doubt that Mary and Joseph sat down and said, "Are we going to go to Jerusalem this year?" No, it's just what they did. They made the decision long ago that this is what they were going to do, and this is how they were going to live their lives, and they did that. Yes?
Verse 42, when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast.
Right.
Was the fact that he was 12 years old, did that have anything to do with the custom of the feast?
No, not necessarily. All this represents was that he was about to enter what they would consider manhood. right?
Multiple things in one verse, they're not tied together.
Right. He's just laying out.
He's 12 years old and they're going to.
Exactly. Yep. Now, at 13, he's considered a man. And so this is kind of and maybe it is with Jesus, he realizes at this point that, as we'll see, that it's time for him to start getting ready now for what's going to happen 17 years later when he's 30. Right? And unfortunately, we don't have, there are some, the infancy gospel of Thomas, and there are some others, and I've done some reading research on these, that they're apocryphal books. We've talked about that in our Wednesday night class. They're not inspired, but they lay out what they think. They're stories of what they believe or somebody believed or somebody made up about Jesus growing up. From the time he was born to the time he was 12. And there's all these mystic, mysterious, magical, supernatural things that happen. And some of it is in direct conflict with the Gospels accounts. And so we know that it's not inspired. And then there's some others that try to fill in the gap between 12 and 30. But really, we don't have anything between that. So this particular episode is unique in the inspired message, and so it does carry some importance with regard to that. But beyond that, I don't think there is any other connection. Any other thoughts or comments, questions about these first 4 verses here? They suppose that he walked with them, right? Is that what it says? Verse 44. They suppose that he was in their caravan or that he walked with them and they went a day's journey, which would have been about 22 miles maybe that they went. And I don't know, again, and going back to Phil, I mean, he's a young adult in their culture. So it wouldn't have been out of, where's Jesus? It's not like he's 2, right? He could have been with friends and acquaintances. He could have been traveling with one of them. Mary and Joseph are just unaware. They suppose. Can it ever be true that we suppose that we're walking with Jesus when we're not? Right? And the other thing is, where did they first seek him? Verse 44. Among his kinfolk. And don't we see that happen oftentimes? When a lot of folks begin to develop some faith, or they start questioning and they start searching, where do they typically search? Family. Is family always the best place to find Jesus? Not always. Yes, family and friends, family and acquaintances, right? He's not necessarily always with the people that we think he is going to be found with, right? Anything else here in these first 4 or 5 verses? No, right. Yeah, I think there is a sense to that, Janice. I think there's a sense that they just expected him to follow the rules and do what he's told, and he probably never, I'm assuming, just based upon who he was and what the text tells us about the man, he never was disobedient to them. They had no reason to question his obedience. But I think that, and we'll get to that towards the end, because I think there's something about that that's starting to change. Because where does his allegiance lie, truly? With his parents or with the Father in heaven? The Father in heaven, right? So we'll get to that. That's a good point. Anybody else? Good comments. They supposed him to be in the caravan. They went a day's journey. And they began looking for him. When they realized that he wasn't among them, when did they start looking for him? Immediately, didn't they? Thank you, Betty. Immediately. You know, when we lost David that day, we didn't go, well, he'll show up. Right? We immediately went into panic mode, searching. And I think there's a great lesson in there for us. When we realize that we're not walking with Jesus, that he's not part of our lives, when do we need to take action and do something about it? Well, when I get time. I mean, that's what a lot of people say. When I have a chance. Isn't that what Felix said in Acts 26? When I have a convenient season. But if we're not walking with Jesus, this morning, you know, if we're not walking with Jesus, when do we need to make that right? You know, the day is coming. I think we sang that song, Mike. It's going to be too late. Tomorrow may be too late. And so they immediately start looking for him. I think that's an important aspect of this that we need not overlook. Any other thoughts, comments on that?
With Jesus, like I said, when you see David, you know, he said the son had a panic mode. So was Jesus lost, or was he in panic mode?
He's not. Jesus isn't. We'll see that. The parents are. And they allude to that too when they find him. The parents are in panic mode. Jesus not. Why? Because where is he at? And we'll get to that, right? Okay. So notice then the searching. Just look at verse 45 here. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Again, they sought him immediately. And then when they couldn't find him, they started backtracking, right? They knew that he had to be in Jerusalem. And so so they sought him immediately, and they sought him sorrowing. And we'll see that in this next section. Verses 46 through 50. Then after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. All right, let's stop here for a second. So after 3 days, now, this doesn't mean that they went back to Jerusalem and they searched for him for 3 days. How far had they gone? A day's journey. How long is it going to take to get back to Jerusalem? Another day. And then on the third day, where do they find him? So that's what the text really means, okay? So it's the third day. When we go to look for Jesus, who are we looking for? Are we looking for the baby in the manger? Or are we looking for, and I actually read in the commentary that I was reading Friday, the commentator even alludes to this and says he doesn't believe it's true, but I think it is. I think there is a foreshadowing here of the resurrection. Because when does Jesus arise from the dead? On the third day. When do they find Jesus? On the third day. I absolutely think there's a foreshadowing here. You know, we talked about the
There's another one that I've got in my mind, though.
What's that?
Where did they find him? Where did they seek him? Where did they find him?
In the temple.
Holy place.
That's right. And where will we find him?
In the holy place in the church.
There you go. I think that was one of my points here too. But you're absolutely right. There are so many. Again, that's kind of why I developed this material this way for this class. There are so many parallels between what happens here and how it can apply to us too. Where do we find Jesus today? Mark 16:15 says, where did Jesus, or I'm sorry, Matthew, in Matthew, Jesus asked his disciples, "Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" Well, some say that thou art John the Baptist or Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But who do you say that I am? Peter answers, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus looks at Peter and says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but in essence, Jesus looks at Peter and he says, "That's right. You're right. I am the Son of God. And flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father. And upon this," well, what's he mean when he says upon this rock? Does he mean Peter? It's the truth. Upon the truth that I am who you just said I am. Just as you are Peter, I am the Christ. And upon this rock, this foundation, this truth, I will build my churches, denominations, world religions, my church. The one church, the body of Christ. Where will we find him? In the church, in his church, right? And unless I get, blowback from people online or whatever, just because a building says Church of Christ on the outside doesn't mean that it is. What makes it a church of Christ, a church of him, is what happens inside the church. And I don't mean inside this building, although that's a part of it. I mean, it's what happens among us. It's what we believe, it's our foundation, it's what we practice, it's what we do, it's who we are. That's what makes us the church. We are the church, the body of Christ. Great points. Matter of fact, I don't want to go there yet. So they sought him immediately. They sought him sorrowing. On the third day, they find him sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening and asking them questions. Now, this isn't just some snot-nosed 12-year-old kid that's trying to show up the teacher. It's not Sheldon, no. He's sitting and a lot of times what would happen during the feast days, if we had a representation of the temple complex, there were all of these alcoves around these little rooms around the outer part of the temple complex, and different teachers would gather together and they would sit in these rooms, and disciples would sit around them and they would teach them. And they would talk to them. In this case, we have, from the text, from the Greek, multiple teachers. Philosophers and priests that have come together and they're sitting and they're discussing. And Jesus is there as one of them. And they're asking questions, and they are astounded at Jesus' responses and the questions that he asks that bring new light and new insight and new clarification. Again, Jesus isn't challenging them in this case. What he's doing is they would quote some scripture and they would talk about it, and then Jesus would respond with true godly wisdom about that text. And they would be like, where did he get? He's right. We've done this, right? And this happens when I'm preaching sometimes. I'll read a text, and this has happened, it gets scary because then I don't know what to do with it. But there have been times that I've been reading a text in the middle of a sermon, and all of a sudden, something will click. That I had never really noticed, or... You ever felt that?
To me, it's always a blessing.
Absolutely. But if you're in the middle of a sermon, it may not be a blessing at that moment. But they're getting this insight from Jesus. And he's asking them questions. Well, if that's true, then what about this? You know? And they're astounded at the questions. They're amazed. Verse 47. All who heard were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When they saw him, that is the parents, verse 48, they were astonished. The word here means that they were confused. Perry, they didn't find their son panicking looking for his parents. He seemed quite at ease where he was at. Comfortable. And they saw what was going on and they were dumbfounded by this.
But I mean, he is Jesus. He knew that his parents would find him.
Well, true. So he didn't have too much to worry about, I guess. I'm right here. I knew you'd find me. But yeah, they're astonished. And his mother says to him, why have you treated us this way? Now, I find this interesting that Mary, but we see Mary is not deity, right? And even though earlier in our study, you know, when she's told, when Elizabeth, when last week when Simeon and Anna said all these things about her son and what he would do, she kept all these things in her heart. She pondered on these things. She considered these things. And now here he is at the age of 12, and she's like, why are you doing this to us? It absolutely is. And it shows her humanity, right? She is a concerned mother. And I'm not critical of her here at all. And she went, yeah, absolutely. It is. Her emotion has taken over.
Do you think she's thinking, my goodness, God put me in charge, and
Well, and I think, again, I think that goes back to what they've said. Any good mother would feel that way. Children are a heritage to the Lord. They have been entrusted to our care, right? And so in that sense, as any good mother would, it's like, God has blessed me with this child, and I'm supposed to take care of him, you know? And so her emotions run over here. And then she says, behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you. Yeah, they're panicked, right? They have been panicked, and they probably couldn't get back to Jerusalem fast enough when they couldn't find him initially.
Does she have a complete understanding of her son?
No, I don't think so.
And his role?
I don't think so.
He was promised he would be a king, he'd be over the throne of David, the king would reign forever.
Right.
But
But it's her son. And she's not deity. She's a woman like any woman, a mother like any mother. And even though, again, she had pondered and considered and kept all these things in her heart, I think this proves that she didn't have a full understanding of what that meant. And back to Andy's comment, when he's hanging on the cross, I don't think she gets it. I still don't think she has fully understood. And like everybody else, it's not until when? After his resurrection, that she finally understands.
I think that's goes back to what you said, well, she's not proving all that proves she's not deity like some of these other thinkers.
Right. Exactly. That's right.
But then she wasn't like all the other mothers. I mean, she gave birth to him.
Well, that's true. I mean, she was a virtuous woman.
Yes, and so there was, she would think she would have known that was a special circumstance here.
Undoubtedly, I think she knew it was special because she knew that she was a virgin and conceived this child. She knew that, again, she had heard all the blessings and all the things that were said about her and her son and all that.
But don't you think his statement to why he was doing what he was doing, the way he was here?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a sense. Listen, and that's a great point, Richard, that we sometimes overlook is some of those, what we would consider negative aspects of Jesus' humanity. There were times that Jesus got irritated. We see that at the wedding feast. When she comes to him, his mother comes to him, and she says, they've ran out of wine. And he's like, what do you want me to do about it? It's not my place. That's not my job. But you're special, Jesus, and you can do these things. And he's like, but that's not why, you know. Exactly. So she doesn't, even though she knows it's special, and she is special, and she knows that her son is special, that he is from God, she still doesn't have a full understanding.
And that's probably the human side.
Yes.
And that mindset, like everybody said, of the mother.
Absolutely.
Physical nurturing aspect that God put in a woman to want to find her child and
Right.
take care of her child. But, you know, his attitude is, you know, I'm about a bigger purpose. I don't need your nurturing.
And I think that's right. And I think that's why he's maybe, and again, she again doesn't have full understanding of what's transpiring here. But I think that juxtaposition between her knowledge and her understanding that she is special and that her son is special and that he has been given to her by God for a special purpose, and her humanity and her limited understanding, when you, I almost feel for her.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting too. We'll see in the next verse or two here where he, in my opinion, he's a little annoyed that she's interrupted, and you know he was about a bigger purpose and she's interrupted, but yet he still goes back into subjection.
He does.
Which is really,
Yes.
I guess he sees the trouble maybe she's having with it, and
Sure.
it's not right or something. I don't know, but it's real interesting.
Yeah. That,
She saw all this stuff, and she kept it in her heart, it's something new.
yes.
And we struggle with that.
Yeah.
We struggle with fully understanding this too. But, I struggle with understanding how Jesus was fully human.
And fully God.
Fully divine.
Yes.
At the same time.
Yeah. And it is, I don't know that we can ever really understand it. I think that's one of those subjects, Richard, where I just have to have faith. And I see the evidence of it in the text, and faith comes by hearing the Word of God, and I see that. But it's kind of like providence. I know it's real. I know it's true. But can I explain it? Not always. Probably not as well as I wish I could. Good points.
Maybe one of these days we get to ask that.
That's what I'm hoping for. One of these days we'll know. All those questions will be answered. Yes.
Don't you think his answer to his mother told her an awful lot?
Oh, absolutely. So let's get to that verse. Verse 49 then. And he responds to them. Now, let me back up for a second. And we kind of alluded to, some religious groups have a problem with Joseph. Some translations say his parents. Did it say that earlier? Yes, verse 43. But his parents were unaware of it. Some, and especially in the Latin text, and some of those following translations from the Latin text, they change parents there to Joseph and his mother, because they won't recognize. Is Joseph his parent? His father? Yeah, absolutely he is. And getting back to Richard, your comment, we're going to see here in a minute, when he returns with them, he is subject to them, to Joseph and Mary, not just to Mary and not just to the father, right? So anyway, she says, behold, your father. She refers to Joseph as his father, and rightly so. How else would she refer to Joseph, right? Oh, this other guy that we live with, and I mean, Joseph was, for all intents and purposes, his earthly father, right? We've been anxiously looking for you. We get that. And he said to them, why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my father's house or about my father's business? Now, Richard, to your point, I guess depending on how we read this and with what inflection, we could read more emotion or intent into this than there is. But I don't know, it may be a little bit of frustration or irritation. It may just be Jesus at this age teaching his mother, helping her have a better understanding of all that she had heard about him.
That's what made
Yeah.
him at that age, even when he speaks to the elders.
But it's funny because verse 50 says they did not understand the statement.
Exactly.
They're still not getting it. And let's be honest, how many of us would have got it? Bill, I probably.
Well, it shows his mother and his brothers and sisters, coming to him
Later, and they think he's crazy.
Yeah, they still didn't know.
They want to have him committed, right? I mean, they think he's out of his mind. They still don't understand. And I think you're right, and I think this is, again, as I mentioned when Phil and I were talking about this earlier, this is, again, because we don't have his early childhood history and we don't have what happens after this before, but when he reappears at 30, what is he ready to do? He's ready for his ministry, right? He's about to be sanctified and set apart for that ministry. John baptizes him, but this is his coming of age story, right? And part of this is that his true allegiance is to who? It's to God, which every young person at some point in time has to come to that point of faith. And going back to what we said earlier, where did they first seek him? Among his family and friends, but they didn't find him there, right? And I remember, and I was raised in the church, but Bill, there was a time, late teens, early 20s, when I really started questioning, why do I believe what I believe? Has anybody else ever done that? Why do I believe what I believe? Do I believe it just because that's what Grandpa and Grandma and Mom and Dad always said? Why is it that I believe what I believe? Why is it that I practice what I practice as a Christian? And going forward, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? And so I began to investigate it. And and maybe it was, I shouldn't say it was too late for me, but it was probably later than it should have been, Mark. And one of the things that I'm afraid that in a lot of ways we have failed with our young people is we haven't helped them develop that faith earlier. And you want to know why so many fall away when they become 18, 19, 20 years old? It's because we haven't. Why? Well, because I said so. Well, that's what the Bible says.
I think it's adamant that each one of us question our own faith and search out why.
Yes.
Why am I doing this? And come to the real answer.
And I've heard people be critical of that, Phil, of that process. Well, you should never question.
I think you should.
I absolutely think you should. I agree. The scriptures tell us to search, to prove. If you hear any other gospel other than that which is preached unto you, What are we supposed to do? Try the spirits, whether they be of God. And if it's another gospel, if it's something else, then we reject it. But how can you do that if you haven't searched? And that's exactly right. It's not my mom and dad's faith. It's not my grandparents' faith. It's not my friend's faith.
Work out your own salvation.
With fear and trembling.
I just think that's all part of it.
I think you're right. And this is what, and so in a sense, even though Jesus is the Son of God, again, Richard, he's still human. And at some point in his childhood and in his maturation, physically and spiritually, which we'll see here in a second, Jesus has to make a decision, who am I going to serve? What am I going to do? And I think this is the moment. And I think sometimes we miss that. They did not understand the statement which he made to them. Okay, where am I at my slides here? So, verses 51 and 52. He went down with them and came to Nazareth. So, they find him after 3 days. They find him in the temple, in the house of God. They find him and they ask him, what are you doing? It must be about my Father's business, in my Father's house. And he goes down with them. Now, real quick, look at Hebrews chapter 13. Let's go back to, as you're turning to Hebrews 13, we were looking at some of those parallels and the applications. When we find Jesus, what happens afterwards? 1 John chapter 1 tells us, verse 7, we walk in the light as he is in the light. We're walking with him. Verse 5 of Hebrews 13, make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have, for he himself has said, what? I will never leave you nor forsake you. When we find Jesus in his house, after we've searched him out and we find him doing his Father's business, he walks with us. That's when he returns with us. Right? He goes back with them to Nazareth, to their home. He continued in subjection to them. Colossians 3, is Jesus obeying the law, obeying his father and mother? Absolutely. Jesus lived the perfect, sinless life, right? He continued in subjection to them, and his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And there it is again, right, Richard? She treasured these things in her heart. But again, then at the wedding feast, what happens, right? At the cross, she never fully comes to that understanding, even though she knows he's special. And sometimes that's true for us. How many people do you know that Jesus is the Son of God? They acknowledge that he is special, that he was the only begotten Son of God, that he built his church, but they still don't have a full comprehension of who he is. So we got to keep searching him. And Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. He developed both physically and spiritually in the next 17 years, where he's... I want to look at one other verse real quick. Look at Matthew chapter 20. We'll close with this. And after good discussion, I'm glad I didn't have all my other notes, because we'd still be talking about it. Matthew chapter 20, beginning in verse 29. And they were leaving Jericho. A large crowd followed him. And two blind men sitting by the road, hearing that Jesus was passing by, cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. They needed Jesus. They were seeking a Savior, somebody to help them, and they weren't going to be stopped. They searched for him immediately. The crowd sternly warns them to be quiet, but they cried out the more, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. And Jesus stops and called them and said, now listen to what does Jesus say? What do you want me to do for you? Now think about that for a second. Jesus goes down to Nazareth in subjection to his parents. When we find Jesus where he is, in his house, and we put our faith and our trust in him, he never leaves us. He never forsakes us. And in a sense, he is subject to us. When we have a need, when we have... What does Jesus want to do? What would you want me to do for you? Does Jesus care about us? Does he care about our sorrows and our passions and our desires and our loves? And absolutely, he cares about all those things. That's exactly right. All right. Awesome. Thank you. We'll pick up next week in chapter 3.